Hello, and welcome to the Narrowing Path, Walking the Spiritual Walk. My name is Stephen Eiderstein, and thank you for joining me as we do the next chapter reading from the book I Was a Pagan by V.C. Kitchen. Getting better at this whole thing. And this is an original printing. You can get this copy as well. I think we're going to be reading chapter 17 out of 18 chapters. We're almost done with the book. And it's been a heck of a journey. So I appreciate everyone that's been on this path with me. And I look forward to finishing this one up, getting started with the next one, and seeing where we go from here. We do have, obviously, this YouTube channel, Spotify channel, whatever you're watching this video on. But we also have a Instagram, a TikTok. You can follow us on Facebook, see all the latest updates, things like that too. So it'll be great. Thank you for joining us again today. So here we go. I'm going to go ahead, and today's podcast is just the reading of the next chapter. This is one of the longer chapters as well, so please bear with me. This is chapter 17 of V.C. Kitchen's I Was a Pagan. Chapter 17. This business of getting ahead in life. Growth. I never felt that I was getting ahead materially in life unless I was able to buy a new and better automobile or to step into a new and better job. When I got the car, however, I soon lost interest in it unless I could keep fitting it out with all sorts of new and fancy gadgets. And when I got the job, I soon lost interest unless it gained me new business or promoted me into higher positions. Acquisition, in other words, had to be followed by growth, or it soon fell into disinterest and disuse. I know now, of course, that spiritual acquisition is the only acquisition worth wanting, let alone worth working for. I would be willing to let God deprive me of automobiles and jobs in order that He might give me more of His spiritual treasures. In the spiritual world, as in the physical world, however, acquisition soon falls into disinterest and disuse unless followed by a steady growth. Christian teaching, as I have tried to show it in recent chapters, is of no avail unless it issue in Christian birth. And Christian birth, in turn, is fruitless unless it issue in Christian growth. I know men and women who were converted 20, 30, 40, or more years ago and who are still inhaling the same spiritual breath they drew on that first day of their conversion. The compelling force of Christ's love has not diminished, but they draw no further breath of it. As a result of this stagnation, they cannot be of maximum use to themselves, to the world, or to God. In some cases, in fact, they are a detriment rather than a benefit to the Christian cause, for the spiritual infant, like the physical infant, is at times clumsy and uneducated. In my case, whatever first impressions I made, my spiritual sponsors in the group guidedly let me have my head. They knew that to cramp unduly this newfound life would be to kill it. They knew that the only way that I would ever learn to bring all my thoughts, actions, and words under God's guidance was to let me note the results of trying to lead a spiritual life on the basis of the truth I already possessed. They knew that if I kept close to God, I could not fail to grow. And they knew that if only through such growth could I become of practical use to Him. Without this growth, in fact, religion in the church is the school. Without this growth, in fact, religion in the church, in the school, in the home, the office, and the forum is just an escape, such as agnostics have accused it of being. As I grew, however, I began to find the reality of religion, And as I found that I not only could be born in Christ, but could grow in Him day by day and hour by hour, I saw that this reality provided an escape of an altogether different nature. It was an escape not from life, but from death. It was an escape not from the reality of life, but from the ugliness, delusion, and sin of life. An escape from the unrealities of life, and a finding of the underlying beauty, truth, goodness, which go to make up God's real design for living. It is not an escape from the responsibilities of marriage, education, politics, society, and the church. It is an escape from the monotony of marriage, the irksomeness of education, the acquisitiveness of business, and hopelessness of politics, the inadequacy of social service, and any ineffectiveness in the church. It is a finding of some happiness, interest, and usefulness in the home, school, and office, and of true leadership in politics, true practicality in social service, and true life in the church. As I grew in my submission and responsiveness to guidance, these facts became constantly more clear to me. And as I bathed in the stream of Christ's atoning blood, the sin was washed from my eyes, and I actually began to see God in the beauties of nature, in the truths of philosophy and science, and in the lives of men. I had heard, for instance, that native Africans do not really begin to note or appreciate the beauties of their natural surroundings until after their conversion. That proved largely true in my own case. In the beauty of a sunset, for example, I used to see not much more than the gorgeous colors that appealed to my aesthetic senses. Now I began to see, with Wordsworth, a presence that disturbs me with the joy of elevated thoughts, a sense sublime of something far more deeply interfused, whose dwelling is the light of setting suns, and the round ocean, and the living air, and the blue sky, and in the mind of man. A motion and a spirit that impels all thinking things, all objects of all thought, and rolls through all things. As I grew, nature sprang to life for me, as had the Bible. I found new life in the minds and affairs of men, a sense of sublime something far more deeply interfused in what I had always regarded as a hopeless snarl of tangled humanity. I came, in fact, to see that, despite this seeming chaos in man's microcosm, God is still at the helm of the macrocosm. I came to see that Robert Browning, that man is not God, but hath God's end to serve, a master to obey, a course to take, somewhat to cast off, somewhat to become. Grant this, then man must pass from old to new, from vain to real, from mistake to fact, from what once seemed good to what now proves best. Spiritual growth, however, was far more than a matter of clearing vision. I not only could see new things in life, but I began to do new things, to find new forms of happiness for myself, and to enter into new forms of usefulness for man and God. It was like advancing from one beautiful room through a suite of rooms constantly more beautiful as I progressed in the depth of my spiritual surrender. My first surrender, for example, was largely a moral surrender. I loosened my hold and yielded up my desire for more obvious carnal sins such as drinking, gambling, and adultery. I found that God had forgiven them and that Christ had swept them away. I also surrendered my fears, malice, envy, resentments, and other attitudes I had borne towards people. I developed, in short, wholly new habits in life and wholly new attitude towards life. I thus came into harmony with the spiritual laws of living, or with what Henry Drummond calls correspondence with our spiritual environment. When, he says, an organ has only partial correspondence with this environment, it is feeble and anemic. Only when correspondence is perfect is vigorous health possible. But when that is established, doors are opened on every side to the treasure stores of the universe. It is said that there are earlier words for happiness, but that adequately to describe the Christian experience, the Greeks had to coin the word joy. I certainly had never known what the word joy really meant until through spiritual growth and increasing correspondence, my doors began to open into the treasure stores of the universe. The best description of this sort of joy which I have ever found appeared in an article entitled 20 Minutes of Reality. It was written by Margaret Prescott Montague and was published in Harper's Magazine. As condensed by the Reader's Digest, this joyous author wrote, "I cannot say what the mysterious change was, or whether it came suddenly or gradually. I saw no new thing, but I saw all the usual things in a miraculous new light. I saw for the first time how wildly beautiful and joyous, beyond any words of mine to describe, is the whole of life. I knew that every man, woman, bird, and tree, every living thing before me, was extravagantly beautiful and extravagantly important. Never in my life before had I seen how beautiful, beyond all belief, is a woman's hair. A little sparrow chirped and flew into a nearby branch, and I honestly believe that only the morning stars singing together and the sons of God shouting for joy can in the least express the ecstasy of a bird's flight. Once, out of all the gray days of my life, I have looked into the heart of reality. I have seen life as it really is, ravishingly, ecstatically, madly beautiful, and filled to overflowing with a wild joy and a value unspeakable. Wow. Since my surrender, I have experienced the same wild joy and sense of value unspeakable. I have reveled in it, not just for 20 minutes, but for days at a time. It once came to me not through meditating upon nature's beauties from a lofty mountain, but in a lowly contemplation of my spiritual shortcomings, while taking off my shoes in an attic bedroom. It came to me at that time when the biggest block still standing between me and God was my still persisting indifference to other people. I surrendered that indifference then and there, and then and there. I was caught up in a new harmony that beggars all description. I had not been born into the spiritual domain, however, which I found myself eagerly seeking such joys. Much as in the physical world I had sought the exhilaration of alcohol, I had begun to seek joy rather than God. In this way, I found that self-indulgence can creep in even on the spiritual level. An indulgent, changed Christian is of little more use to God than an indulgent, unborn Christian. And God very properly and promptly took these newfound joys away from me. He reminded me again that the Christian must be an active Christian and that this work lies largely with other people. He brought me up against rebuffs in my own home and against harsh criticisms outside my home, forcibly recalling that I was still not only in the hand of the living, but in the land of the living, but in the land of the unborn Christian and the unconverted pagan. There was work to be done, a further growth to experience, and through guidance, he indicated clearly that I should begin to think less about my spiritual joys and more about the needs of the other fellow. This came about when, after my first enthusiastic and fruitless attempts to convert my relatives and friends, I began to realize that I myself did not have the insight to get down to a man's real need, and that even should I diagnose it correctly, I myself did not have the power to remove that person's sin and to transform his nature. Gradually, however, I learned to stop trying to work for God. I learned to let Him work through me. I learned to seek and to rely on His spiritual diagnosis rather than my own sizing up of a man. I learned to let God tell me what the matter might be with the other fellow. I learned to draw the other man into prayer, quiet time, or other direct relations with God, where God could speak as plainly to him. I learned to let God tell me and the other fellow what should be done about restitution for these sins. I learned to seek from Him the power to accomplish these results where we were helpless in our own strength. As I grew in this humility, I grew in usefulness to God. Finally, sweeping me over the last bars of self-consciousness and embarrassment which made me hesitate to look into another man's sins, God used me actually to change a life. And then He used me to change another, then another, and another. Physicians tell me that watching human birth is the most awe-inspiring and reverential experience. I doubt, however, it can compare in sheer wonder and sheer joy with watching human rebirth, especially when you are used to assist at such a rebirth under God's guidance. But self, as I learned to my sorrow, was still at work. As my number of spiritual children began to mount, I began to fill with pride and satisfaction. It was no doubt the same sort of pride and satisfaction that a surgeon might feel after his first string of successful operations. In the surgeon of souls, however, such emotions are a serious hindrance. Pride is always a barrier which cuts off God's power, and some of my operations became not so successful. Some of my spiritual children relapsed into an unregenerate stage of paganism. God saw that self was creeping in to short circuit harmony and insight. He again proceeded to take corrective measures. I had not, in other words, progressed far enough along the path from self to draw others after me and give them there a firm foothold in the further ground which the Oxford group calls continuance. At this juncture, therefore, God sent me through an unusually long dry spell, through a sort of arid desert of the soul, in which he set me to the task of shaking out the vestiges of self that still kept me from becoming a wholly free and useful servant. One morning, for example, as I sought to make surrender of one of my pet plans and a force other than my own took hold of me and shook me till I almost felt it physically. These little sins, in fact, were more deeply and firmly rooted and took a lot more shaking than many of the sins I thought were big ones. They were the roots of my basic sins, sins of which my grosser acts were only symptoms. Drinking, for instance, proved to be only the symptom of loneliness and boredom, which in turn were rooted in pride and selfishness. With love for God flooding me and tempting me upward instead of downward, and thus tempting me away from the bottle, it was comparatively easy to loosen my grip on this mere symptom of a sin and let Christ's stream carry it away from me. As Professor Grenst of Oxford points out, however, sin is the only thing we ourselves have created, the only thing that we ourselves really own and possess. The deeper the sin, therefore, the deeper the possessiveness. And while letting go of alcohol, I still clung to my basic pride and selfishness. With God's help, it was easy to give up drinking, and with God's help, it would be easy to help other drinkers quit. But when it came to not drinking in the praise of those who admired my new stand, when it came to not lapping up the thanks of those I had helped to quit, when it came to recognizing and admitting that all of this was God's work and none of it mine, That was another question. Still, however, God continued with my spiritual growth. He showed me, as F.B. Meyer suggests, that even while I sang his praises, I was inclined to admire my own singing. He showed me that, while my face shone with a new light, I was noting that fact in the mirror. He showed me that, in my most earnest appeals to come to Christ, I was greatly admiring my own earnestness. He showed me that I was proud even of my new humility, and that I congratulated myself on the knowledge of divine things which other men might not possess. He showed me in business that while I had given up dishonest writing and dishonest dealing, I was still prone to defend my work rather than admit to my partner or client that I had slapdash through it in order to get at what I considered some of the more important and interesting detail of God's business. He taught me that if any of my work proved uninteresting, I could not be, at such a time, really doing his business. He taught me that while he could use me to convert other businessmen, he could not yet do so on as large a scale as he would like, and that he could not use me to carry these others very far into continuance. In the home, he taught me that while I was now ready to let Christ control all my decisions in family matters and in any difference of opinion, I was not yet ready to let him control all of my thoughts and words, let us say at the dinner table. I was still prone to snap at my children if they annoyed me by snapping at each other. I was still inclined to dream there about my book or other matters of personal interest rather than let God use my mind to dwell in others and their interests and their needs, as Christ himself would dwell there. In life generally, he taught me that while it was easy to be honest in money matters and easy not to lie, it was not so easy to refrain from witnessing beyond my experience, to refuse to talk of things on which I was not quite clear, to keep my guidance uncolored by personal desires or opinions. He taught me that while it was easy to keep my mind free from thoughts of sexual impurity, it was not so easy to keep it free from all impurity, meaning any strain of thinking that runs contrary to God's will. He taught me that while it was easy to be obviously unselfish and to give in gracefully when anything came up, it was not so easy to go out of my way to be unselfish, looking for the need in other people and holding them to their best. He taught me that while it was easy to love those for whom I had a natural affinity, it was not easy to love those who are unlovely or seemed undeserving of my love. In my work for him, he taught me that competition, imitation, and comparison were still apt to creep into my work. He showed me that I felt more comfortable with those spiritually behind me than those out ahead. He showed me that in checking my plans with others of the group, I was still hoping that they would do the thinking and take the final responsibility. He showed me that such sharing and checking was not yet the happy overflow of a real relationship, but it still contained some fear and pretense of fellowship. He showed me that while I was submitting to a certain amount of discipline and public persecution, I was not ready to go barefoot or submit to stoning as a martyr. Theologically, he showed me that the cross was the only possible and ultimate termination of my self-life. He showed me that while I had taken up my cross to follow him, I had not yet nailed myself upon the cross. I had not really crucified the ego in me. In this supreme revelation of his love, in other words, God through Christ had shed his blood for me. He gave his life that I, seeing the great depth of such a love, might find a higher love than self-love. The only dynamic powerful enough to raise me above self-centered sin. In ancient lore, I found that the blood covenant was the most sacred compact ever made between men. It superseded every other form of treaty or agreement ever known. I had entered into a new compact with God. I had made it a blood covenant on his side. What like degree of sacrifice had I made on mine? What had I done to make myself a blood brother of Christ? I had brought him my soiled life, and he had cleansed it. The least I could do in return was to lay down my own life to cleanse others in his name. I thought I had done so. At this juncture in my growth, however, he showed me how little of myself had really died. He showed me that when my will crossed God's will, I still too often chose my own way. I had still, therefore, to go through a real experience of the cross. I had thought I saw that neither I nor any other man would ever fully understand the cross in this life. I also saw how far I still had to go. It was when I began to grow through these further reaches that I really began to lead a Christ-centered rather than an egocentric life. It was only then that I passed through the outer fringes of surrender to the place where he gives up more than bad habits and attitudes, and where we give away more than our time in listening to other people's problems and helping them relate their need to its remedy in Christ. It is here where we really lay down our very lives, finding no survival desire other than the desire to follow God, forming no plan other than to find and follow God's plan, holding no idea other than that of self, sacrificed for the common good in such ways as God may direct. It is here, in other words, that we may really begin to go all the way out for Christ. That chapter really was an important one for me to just read right now in my personal life. To remember that I'm still a very willful person, very egocentric person, that I can still get in the way of so much. And I still got a lot of work to do. So that was a great chapter. That was an awesome, awesome reading, actually. To be reminded of how much I still resist doing the right things and how willful I still am as a person sometimes. Many times, actually. Just kind of blows my mind. That was exactly what I needed to read today. I hope that's something y'all needed to hear. And thank you for joining me for the reading today. Absolutely incredible, as always. So I am looking forward to tearing this chapter apart next weekend with y'all. Give me a like, give a subscribe, comment, whatever you'd like. I'd love to hear from you. Hopefully you've been enjoying this journey with me. So we'll be back again next weekend. So until next time, thanks.